Overcoming by Pure Foy's Girl. Chapter 29. Word traveled like wildfire on the heels of the masquerade, fueled by tales from the Dim and Garden party and putting Will squarely in the eye of society's attention. Hannibal took absolute delight in it, reveling in Will's surprise when people called out to him and strove to insinuate themselves in his good graces. Yet, for being so out of his depth, Will was never once in over his head. He took everything with aplomb and his usual grace, undaunted by anyone or anything, and eager to see all that he could of the capital, which his husband had called home. Hannibal showed Will the city as only a native could. The factories belching smoke into the skies, the great bridge that crossed the sister river which ran past Hartford, the water foul with runoff. They toured his office, and he watched Will's brilliant, inquisitive mind taking stock of it all, and what it would take to bring something similar to Hartford. His serious, bright-eyed mate's mute excitement was heartening to see, and it touched Hannibal how he tried so hard not to show too much interest in anything. The echo of those damned gods again, searching to snatch away what happiness he might eke from the world around him. Now they would have to get through Hannibal first, and he had every confidence in his power to stop them. They made it a point to visit the Museum of Science and Industry in order to see the Expo, and found themselves embroiled in a heated debate regarding the separation of church and state with a brilliant young inventor whose only limitation was his unwavering terror of hubris. Despite coming to a draw, the discourse put Will in an excellent humor, which Hannibal teased him about on their walk home. "Perhaps I was a bit impassioned," Will owned, a sheepish grin curving his lips. Night was coming again, a gentle blanket of darkness that softened the harsh edges of the capital and teased forth the stars. It was pleasant to watch the lamps being lit, pleasant to be strolling on the less crowded sidewalks with his husband's arm laced through his. "I never imagined myself to be quarrelsome." "I wouldn't say vigorously defending your statements with undeniable facts as being quarrelsome," Hannibal said, chuckling at the memory of his mate's flushed cheeks and the excited sparkle in his eyes, all self-consciousness abandoned to making his case, and Hannibal right there in the thick of it with him, just as vehement. "He enjoyed it as much as you did, I should think." "Though clearly not as much as you," Will said, tugging on his arm. He idly glanced at the shops as they passed, and said, "Oh, that reminds me, I need to purchase a hat, one with, flowers and feathers." "Are you formulating a plan to disarm him with your appearance before delivering the fatal blow?" Hannibal asked, delighted when Will turned his gloved fingers against his arm and pinched him. "Ah, but you have no need of such tricks when your wits were more than a match for him." "Quite right," Will said, though he was smiling as he said so. "No, Miss Hobbs entertained me with her talk of hats. I understand that she never had one that was new. I thought I might bring her one as a gift." "First Prince Bert, now a maid. How many of us will you have dancing on your line, Will?" "Who knows?" Will said, with that sly, wry look Hannibal had so quickly come to adore. "You might add the printer to your list of conquests. He was fairly smitten by you." "Nonsense, he was nothing of the sort," Will said, chuckling when Hannibal moved to open the gate onto Chelsea House. "What? What is it?" Hannibal asked, noting his sudden grin and smiling in response. "It seems I am not to be subjected to any manner of openable object when you are within reach," Will observed, moving past him toward the door with a small incline of his head. "Doors, gates. Luckily it has not occurred to you to open my letters for me." "Well, it has now," Hannibal called after him, closing the gate with a laugh. "You are my husband, and I will protect you." "From my papers?" Will asked, amused. Mr. Black opened the door wide and waited on them, poker-faced and patient. "From anything that seeks to harm you," Hannibal said, reaching the stoop and raising Will's hand for a kiss, a merry twinkle in his amber eyes when he murmured, "Particularly papers." "Well, you won't be protecting me from my correspondence any time too soon," Will said, crossing the threshold and handing his greatcoat off to Mr. Black, "as we have forgotten in all the excitement to visit the solicitor's office." Hannibal frowned and said, "I will return shortly." "Must you?" Will asked, mystified to see the number of cards waiting for them in the foyer. "There were no pressing matters. It can surely wait until tomorrow." "I insist on delivering such dangerous items from your presence," Hannibal said, dropping a kiss on Will's forehead where the familiar wrinkles had appeared. "Don't be cross." "I am never cross," Will reminded him, cocking his head in warning.
"Merely thoughtful. Well, that is something I cannot protect you from, sadly enough,"
Hannibal said, donning his hat again in preparation to leave.
"Check the cards for any invitations that might entice you, and we will decide on my return who to spend the rest of our evening with."
He tipped his hat to Will with a charming smile and a wink before vanishing out into the night again. Will moved to the window and watched him go back toward the Row, moving with purpose. He was alone on the street, a solitary figure in lamplight, slowly swallowed by a thickening fog. A sharp pang welled in his chest, the impulse to go after him taking him by surprise with its strength, this fervent wish that his husband should not walk alone. How happy he himself would have been in days gone by for the company of another beside him. Will swallowed back the tightness in his throat when Hannibal's form vanished entirely. The pang became a dull ache, so palpable that he pressed his hand to his heart to ease it, unsettled and saddened.
"We are very glad you are here, Lord Clarges,"
Mr. Black said, aware of his sudden distress and reaching out in the way only he could, through conversation.
"He has always been a peculiar boy, but even peculiar people need love."
Will looked away from the window, a light flush on his cheeks to be caught so unguarded. He knew what his father would make of this moment, of his response. He would call him silly for feeling such a thing, nothing more than a simpering omega pining for their alpha out of an excess of foolish ignorance. There was no censure, however, in Mr. Black's soft comment, only relief.
"He has been alone for a very long time,"
Mr. Black said, turning his own gaze to the window to free Will of his scrutiny.
"Even as a baby."
"You served the family since even then?" Will asked, surprised as Mr. Black was not all that aged, far younger than Mr. Hawkes, and certainly younger than poor half-deaf Mr. Thatcher.
"I just become a footman here at Chelsea House when his lordship was born, youngest one on staff,"
Mr. Black said, beaming a bit, as well he should in Will's opinion.
"Tragedy seems to haunt the Lecter family. Her ladyship was so very excited to be a mother. She didn't speak very much of our language, but her lady's maid did, and often passed on to us how she wanted a whole house full of children."
"You knew her?" Will said, drawing closer to him, grateful for the curiosity that rescued him from the strange sense of loss he felt, as if fate had spied him there in the window and pressed her thumb on his heart in dire warning that he was not forgotten. "It must stand to reason you knew the Lady Murasaki as well." Mr. Black turned and gave him a sharp look, surprised to hear him say her name.
"His Grace forbids us to speak of her, my lord."
"But she is why Hannibal has always been alone. Is she not?" Mr. Black studied him, contemplating his next words carefully.
"No, my lord. She is not the reason he is always alone. She was kept from him. From the little girl as well, little Misha."
Will's mind turned those words over and over, unable to put them into a configuration that matched what little he had learned so far.
"I always thought it odd,"
Mr. Black said, affecting not to notice Will's sudden retreat into his thoughts.
"Misha is a Lituvian name. 'Twas her ladyship planned to name her child had your husband been born a girl."
It was odd, indeed, and Will puzzled over it, asking, "Have you any idea why Lady Murasaki would give her daughter a name Hannibal's mother had chosen?"
"I am not a betting man, my lord,"
Mr. Black said with a small smile,
"but were I to do so, I would put money on the chance that she did not choose the name at all."
Will felt an even deeper desire to know what she had written in her journal, and asked with uncharacteristic abruptness, "Has Mr. Price come in?"
"He has. Shall I fetch him for you, my lord?"
"Yes, Mr. Black, if you could," Will said, picking up the salver of cards that had piled up in their absence. "And, Mr. Black—" The butler was instantly attentive, the familiarity lost to professional reserve. "Thank you," Will said, smiling when the butler eased somewhat. "I would never countermand an order given by his Grace, so I appreciate your candor. I know what it is like to be lonely, and you are right. Even peculiar people need love."
"If you're both odd, my lord, then I suppose put together that makes you even."
"Why, Mr. Black, I can see your humour has influenced my husband."
"I certainly hope it has, my lord,"
Mr. Black said, bowing as he moved to ring for Jimmy.
"I certainly hope it has."
Hannibal's feet took him to the solicitor's office without his being aware of it, a path which was so familiar he need not even direct himself. Most of him remained behind, with Will, with the shadowy form of his mate backlit at the window when he chanced to look back. He had watched Hannibal go, observing from silent solitude. He wondered if Will had watched him leave Hartford in such a way all those years ago, still unassuming, his attention unmarked. He wondered if Will would always watch him go, waiting for the inevitable moment when he would not return, and leave him all alone yet again. It led him to uncomfortable thoughts of the war, and the discussions had over the course of the night at the ball, interspersed with dances where he treasured Will's enjoyment all the more. Things were not going well. Things were likely to continue not going well. He hoped and prayed that duty would not call him back out to the front, but he could not guarantee it, and felt shamefully relieved that Will had remained behind, if only so that he could make arrangements without upsetting him for no reason. Mr. Buddish was still in when Hannibal arrived, and greeted him with his usual perfunctory good manners.
"You just missed Mr. Berger?"
he said, gesturing for Hannibal to sit.
"He was here about an hour ago." "Was there anything of note?" Hannibal asked, settling himself in the plush, comfortable chair before his desk. "Mr. Wells sent paperwork and a note to Lord Clarges. You've several responses to your request for an estate manager,"
Mr. Buddish said, making an impatient gesture at his secretary to bring them fresh tea.
"I've compiled them for you. I intended to send them with Berger in the morning in case some stragglers came in this evening."
"I will take them, and you may send the stragglers along in shame. Has Zeller been in?" Hannibal asked, watching Mr. Buddish gather the inquiries into a tidy pile and place them into an envelope.
"I expect Mr. Zeller to report in tomorrow, according to his grace. I'll be sure to make a copy of his report for you."
Hannibal fished out the letters, both his own as well as Will's, and handed them over.
"Please send these along to Hartford. And I meant to ask if you received correspondence from grandfather concerning the disposition of the house."
"Recently?" Mr. Buddish confirmed.
"No, I haven't. There's the original agreement he drew up that places Hartford House in your spouse's name until such time as an alpha male heir is born, and then the addendum altering the specifications to any sound and living child of yours by your spouse. I've requested that the addendum be destroyed,"
Hannibal said, watching Mr. Buddish go to one of his many cabinets in search of the documents.
"Grandfather wrote to you some days ago with instructions to send all copies back to him. You never received anything."
Mr. Buddish, to his credit, did a thorough check, even though they both knew that he prioritized the Duke's business and handled all of it personally. He shook his head and told Hannibal,
"My apologies, my lord, but I have no such instructions, and without specific notarized permissions from your grandfather, I cannot allow you to lay claim to, amend, or destroy any documentation regarding Hartford House." "I know the old goat didn't want me wiggling out of the stipulations 6 years ago," Hannibal said, cursing the necessity. "Things have changed, however. I want you to do an accounting of my assets, any entitlements that can be met for my spouse." "Of course, my lord,"
Mr. Buddish said, taking notes.
"Have you some particular concern?"
"Several, not the least of which is that Will should be well provided for should I be recalled to the front and not return." He was not a superstitious man by any means, but he felt as if he had somehow called the possibility to a certainty merely by mentioning it out loud. He pictured Will's blue eyes as they had been nearly 7 years ago, their brightness dimmed by hardship and cares that he should never have been burdened by.
"Please gather an accounting of his own assets, and the dowry he brought as well. I want papers drawn up to state that under any circumstances in the event of my death, Hartford House belongs to Will, without stipulation or restriction. I'll be sure that it's noted, my lord,"
Mr. Buddish said, doing so as he spoke.
"Naturally, any decision your grandfather makes takes precedence, but should something befall you, your wishes will be considered in the case that there is an issue."
Hannibal nodded, somber and solemn.
"Grandfather said that you send back a copy of anything you register for him. He mentioned the addendum copy has not yet arrived."
Mr. Buddish flipped open his ledger and scanned it quickly, a frown bowing his mouth.
"My lord, the copy was sent the day after we received the addendum itself. Have you checked with Mr. Stamets? He brings everything to grandfather like clockwork. It is vastly disturbing for me to imagine that there is a copy of that ghastly document unaccounted for. I never want my spouse to know that such a vile thing exists. He should never be troubled by it when it has no meaning any longer. I'll put someone on it, my lord,"
Mr. Buddish said, looking fairly disturbed himself.
"It is not entirely unheard of for things to wander from the direct path, but never something of such importance for someone, or greater importance for your grandfather. I shall see to this myself." "Thank you, Mr. Buddish."
Hannibal said, wishing it alleviated some of his anxiety.
"It is of monumental importance to me that all agreements barring Will from ownership of Hertford House be destroyed." "I understand, my lord. I will contact you when I have the information you've asked for, and when the documents have been acquired. If needs be, I will ride to Hertford myself to get his Grace's permission to make the alterations you've mentioned."
It was very little to accomplish, very little indeed, but it was all Hannibal could manage under the circumstances, and it had to suffice. "You rang for me, my lord?" Jimmy asked, coming into the parlour and closing the panel behind him. Will looked up from the neat stacks of cards with such an expression of horror on his face that Jimmy chuckled a little and said, "Bit much?" "Just a bit. These are all from today. Only from today, Jimmy." "Well, you are a person of some import," Jimmy said, moving to sit next to him on the settee and glance through the cards. "And Lord Clarges knows nearly everyone in the capital. Oh, I meant to tell you there's a package upstairs for you."
"From whom?"
Will asked, drawing brows together. "I'm not sure, but it was delivered from one of the shops today," Jimmy said, still looking at the cards. "It's on your vanity."
"Thank you, Jimmy," Will said, somewhat flustered. "I'll check on it when I go up to bed. I wanted to ask you if you'd made any headway in the translation of Lady Murasaki's journal."
"Well, I might have, my lord," Jimmy said, hands stacked on his knee. "I made some inquiries at several small vendors, and they directed me to the eastern end of the capital. Seems there is an entire city within the city that represents the most amazing cultures. I really think you would enjoy seeing it, my lord. The building structure, the signage, everything about it, it's like stepping foot into another land without leaving the city."
"That sounds very interesting, Jimmy. Was anyone there familiar with the language?"
"The first person I asked said it was a script very close to one he used, but not common here in the capital. I wandered around for a while and saw a shop selling the most astonishing lacquerware, looked quite a lot like the jewelry box on your vanity. I went inside, and the girl running the place said her grandfather could read it. She told me she would take the book and show him, and gave me this as surety for it."
He produced a small box from his breast pocket. The size reminded Will of Anthony's cigarette case, but this box had a tiny latch and a beautiful forest scene inlaid onto its face.
"She said to come back in a week for his decision," Jimmy said, giving the box to Will so that he could inspect it. "There's a strong possibility he won't do it, but she said she would try her best. I might have hinted at generous compensation for his time."
"More than generous if he can translate it," Will said, handing it back to Jimmy and telling him, "Please put this with Lady Murasaki's jewelry box, and be sure that both are packed when we prepare to leave. I will not offer offence by misplacing something which was made with such care by a master craftsman."
"I'll make sure of it, my lord," Jimmy said, tucking it securely away.
He stood to go, but stopped, fishing something from his other jacket pocket.
"Berger came from the solicitor's about an hour ago and brought this for you. There was a packet of paperwork with it that I put on your desk upstairs."
"Thank you, Jimmy,"
Will said, taking it from him to see who had sent it. "I think I'll pop off to do some shopping, if that's all right with you," Jimmy asked, pausing at the door. "You're nearly out of scent blocker. I meant to pick it up yesterday, but with all the excitement it just slipped my mind."
"Oh, Jimmy, wait," Will said, pondering for a moment. "Even with the scent blockers and tonics, Hannibal still seems to catch my scent. I have the sneaking suspicion my suppressants aren't working very well anymore."
Jimmy's mouth puckered in concern. "Mr. Bainbridge, the man who sells to us, did mention they would grow increasingly inefficient over time." Will frowned, wondering why he was even considering the suggestion currently fluttering around in his head.
"I was thinking perhaps I might not use anything for a little while," Will said, a flush colouring his cheeks as he said it, resisting the lifelong conditioning that warned him such dedicated exposure to an alpha was affecting his thinking, that deep down he was being nothing more than a brainless omega hoping his scent would bind an alpha to him. The excuse that Hannibal caught his scent seemed so flimsy as to be embarrassing, just the sort of reasoning an omega would use. He nearly took the statement back, the thought was so powerful and so upsetting, and opened his mouth to do so. "How about," Jimmy said, hitting on the crux of the issue from long familiarity with Will, and reading the sudden panic on his face, "we just give it some time and see how it goes?" Will looked at him, surprised, but was reassured by Jimmy's sincere smile.
If you decide you don't like how it makes you feel, then I'll go right out and we'll get you started with another brand. How does that sound?" Will smiled, relieved that Jimmy could always find the right thing to say. "Thank you, Jimmy. Please, go ahead and go out if you wish. 'Tis a pleasant evening, and should be enjoyed." The valet excused himself, leaving Will alone in the parlour with his weighty thoughts and the worrisome calling cards. He rubbed his eyes, nervous to think that he would no longer be hiding behind the screen of his products. Scent was something his father had remarked on with a sneer, though Will had never used suppressants or blockers in his keeping, nor been forced it. Rather, his father seemed to relish being able to point it out and remark on it. But Hannibal... He thought of how his husband had looked last night, a horned raven stag nuzzling the blue silk of his garter, and sighing as if he had never been given anything so pleasing in his life. And afterward, the kiss they had shared that had left him aching for more, the way Hannibal touched him and breathed him in like a starving man seeking nourishment. Perhaps it wasn't his Omega nature misleading him into using his wiles. Perhaps it was the simple fact that it was a part of him, and he had no need to hide it from his husband now that so much of their future was at stake. The thought calmed him somewhat, and left him more confident in his decision to allow the suppressants to work out of his system. As Jimmy said, if he felt strange or too vulnerable, he could always restart a new and better product with little trouble. Content to leave that decision where it stood for now, Will turned to the letter Jimmy had given him, one ear trained on the door to catch Hannibal's return, even though he had only just left. Mr. Wells had written to inform Will that the crew was prepared to begin digging for the plumbing as early as tomorrow, and that they had permission to tie into Mosley's gas supply if they wished to fit Marsham for lighting. With such concrete issues before him, Will was able to distract himself from the pile of visitors' cards and the vague sense of restlessness that rose in Hannibal's absence, as well as the promise of the journal's translation. He did some rough estimates and refined them some, losing himself in the details. The details were his specialty, where he could forget the world for a time and deal with things that he could not disassemble. He was so absorbed in his work, he almost didn't register the commotion happening at the front door. When the ruckus finally penetrated his awareness, his heart leapt, thinking Hannibal had returned. It sank once again, however, when he heard shouting, "Let me through!" Will caught the wood smoke and leather scent of Francis Dolarhyde, just as it began to sharpen to sulphur with the force of his anger. Before he could rise and find out the problem, the parlour door opened and Francis poured in on a wave of anxious upset, Mr. Black and 2 footmen in his wake, and vainly trying to restrain him. "Lord Clarges," Francis said, his voice harsh and raw from shouting. He pulled against the other men so hard that Will feared for their safety, and surged to his feet, calling, "Stand down! Let him go!" They did so, and Francis flung himself forward, stumbling to a stop before Will, shuddering with the force of his panting breath. "You all may go," Will said, more abrupt with them than was his habit, but he did not wish for any more witnesses to Francis's outrageous behaviour than there already were. "My lord, this person nearly broke in the servants' entrance," Mr. Black said, affronted that the dignity of Chelsea House would be tried so greatly. "When that accomplished nothing, he came through the front door of this house." "I apologize on his behalf," Will said, shooing them away. "I deeply regret any trouble he has caused. He is not used to service. Please go back to your duties. I will handle the situation." With obvious reluctance, Mr. Black and the 2 footmen retreated, and Will closed the door. He took a moment to compose himself, the brimstone scent fading to leather as Francis calmed, though he trembled like a beast facing slaughter, his blue eyes wide and wild. Without saying a word, Will returned to his seat and took up his pen, pointedly ignoring the alpha in the middle of the room. His thoughts were too scattered now to continue, but Francis need not know that, and after a few moments of stewing on his own behaviour, Francis said, "I could not find you." Will dabbed the pen into his inkwell before he said, "You have found me now?" Francis shifted, head dropping in contrition. "Would you please explain to me, Francis," Will said, writing a few lines of notes before he forgot them entirely, "why you felt compelled to terrorize the good people of this house with your actions?" "Lord Clarges," Francis said, taking a deep, rasping breath, "I was frightened something had happened to you when I could not find you. Will put his writing things away, still not looking at Francis. When he finished, he turned in his chair and folded his hands in his lap before pinning Mr. Dolarhyde with a stern, unyielding stare. Something did happen to me. I went a full 24 hours without anything in the world to trouble me, including the unacceptable behavior of a man I have brought into my household. Francis's head tipped down further, shoulders slumping but his fists clenching. Honestly, Francis, you vanished from Marsham Heath without a word to me about it, forcing me to attempt to excuse your behavior to my husband, who is already disposed to view you unfavorably.
I could not find you,
Francis cut in, the words an explosion of anguish. He looked at Will, blue eyes swimming with distress.
I thought something had happened to you. Have you any idea what would become of me?
The unsteady agitation that gripped him caused Will to abandon his irritation for concern. What do you mean, Francis? Why should anything happen to you?
I can't allow you to suffer,
Francis said, his voice falling to harsh whisper. He dropped to his knees before Will and moved as if he would take Will's hand, only drawing back at the last moment to breathe.
I could not live if something were to happen to you.
Will shifted in the chair, but there was nowhere to go with Francis's large body before him. The nervousness that always rode beneath the surface of his surety in Francis came to the surface, fluttering wings of panic beneath his ribs that he refused to acknowledge. "What are you saying, Francis?" he asked, a dreadful, unhappy certainty blooming in his gift. This was no servant before him, no soul dedicated to his safety. This was...
Don't you know?
Of course he knew. He knew it to the depths of himself. The same unwholesome tragedy that had overcome him 6 years before, under the bright morning sun, on a day that should have been perfect. "No," he whispered, shaking his head in denial of it. He stood then, the chair sliding away and falling over with the force of his retreat. "No."
"I wouldn't lie to you,"
Francis said, turning to follow Will with his eyes as he paced away, putting distance between them, still shaking his head, as if he could somehow negate what Francis was telling him through sheer willpower.
"When you were little."
"No," Will said, pointing at him, a staying gesture better suited for a dog. "Do not tell me this."
"That day when I left," Francis said, lunging to his feet. "What else could I do?"
"I cannot hear this," Will said, lowering his voice to a trembling whisper. "Francis, you cannot say such things." Francis trembled, a shudder that traced his large frame.
"It happened, and there's nothing to be done for it."
Will closed his eyes, blocking out the sight of him, wishing he could block out the rest just as easily.
"You are in so much pain,"
Francis said, the tread of his boots quiet on the thick rug.
"I didn't know what was happening until it was too late. The moment I picked you up, I felt—"
"No," Will whispered, but it was meaningless, an empty sound that solved nothing, did nothing but hold the truth at a distance without changing it.
"Every time you hurt,"
Francis said, intruding on the darkness behind Will's eyes.
"Every time you wept, every time you suffered, I could feel it, and still do."
Will drew a breath that was sour with Dolarhyde's smoky scent, churning his stomach in response.
"You don't really remember?"
I don't," Will said, as much to reinforce it to himself as to Francis. "I was too young." Francis inhaled sharply and said,
"What your father did to you that day is what triggered it."
"Don't," Will insisted, shaking his head violently again, not wanting the reminders, not wanting to think of it.
"Dress to match,"
Francis said, pushing ahead while Will dug his heels in, not wanting to revisit that moment.
"There was no telling you apart except by scent. 2 precious little angels in frothy frocks riding ponies in a little parade. You remember, you must remember."
Yes, Francis, I remember."
"Mina cried,"
Francis whispered, and Will sensed him moving closer. He opened his eyes and stepped backwards, not wanting the Alpha near him, especially feeling as fragile as he was.
"Your sister screamed, and your father left you where he dropped you, like garbage."
The unwelcome completion of that sentence in Will's thoughts made him flinch. The child in him reduced to so much human detritus, insignificant and meaningless. It woke a physical pain in him like the dull throb in his hip that ached in the cold. His sister screaming, Iris's pale, shocked face, and a shadow that loomed over him. You carried me home," Will breathed, recalling it now, his gaze lifting in surprise. "You carried me all the way back to the house and took me to the nursery."
"Don't fret, Mr. Graham, I've got you."
Younger and slimmer and simmering with outrage, but he'd been gentle with Will even in his anger, and his assurances had calmed him despite the frightening pain he'd been in.
"I wanted to protect you, but I couldn't. You never cried, not once. You were so brave, so helpless, and I couldn't save you."
Tears sheened Will's eyes unexpectedly, tears which were long overdue, gratitude for kindness that the child he'd been had never expected, and the adult he was still marveled over.
"I couldn't protect you from your father,"
Francis quietly insisted, his earnest, imploring glance nearly undoing Will all over again.
I couldn't remain. I couldn't face a situation I couldn't change in your favor."
"You were kind to me. It was neither expected nor deserved, but you were, and you were punished for your kindness with such a terrible connection. How do I thank you for what you did for me without legitimizing the result?" Francis stared at him, drinking in the details of his features, his longing for acknowledgment almost palpable. But it was an acknowledgment that Will simply could not give. "We can never speak of this again, Francis," Will whispered, straining to his full height, shoulders squared. "If you have any desire to remain near me, never speak of this again." Francis said nothing, but Will could see in his tension that he wanted to unleash his alpha temper and speak his mind. The fact that he didn't brought Will to say, "I will hold this in confidence, Mr. Dolarhyde. If you speak it, if you say it, then I will have no choice but to tell my husband. As it stands, I will dismiss this as an excess of passion born of your fear, and we will never speak of this again." Those bright blue eyes flicked up, surprise and wariness in their depths. "I know how difficult such a thing is," Will said, doing his best not to allow his understanding to soften him too much. Shared experience did not, he knew, mean a similar one, and he could not afford to allow Francis to hope. "You must understand, we will never progress past this point." Francis searched his face, finding more in his statement than Will meant to offer.
"I know it cannot,"
he said, relaxing his tense posture and dropping his gaze, hiding his thoughts from Will's sharp eyes.
"It cannot be undone, except through death."
The statement drew troubling conclusions from Will. Softly he asked, "You believe that if I die, you might as well?" Francis was slow to answer, but when he did, it was with a nod.
"When you have suffered, I have felt it so keenly. I know with complete certainty that we will die together, Lord Clarges, you and I."
A cold chill swept down Will's spine, a river of dread, lifting the fine hairs on his nape and making him shudder. "I am sorry this happened to you, Francis," he said, and genuinely meant it. His mouth tightened, determination hardening him to Francis's awful circumstances. His voice was even with grim calm when he said, "Let me assure you, I have no intentions of dying any time soon."
"Nor will you,"
Francis said, straightening to his full height and putting every ounce of formidable alpha threat in his voice, when he added,
"I swear to you that as long as I am near, you will not suffer."
Will studied him for a moment, but what he saw there did no more to reassure him than Francis's harsh, growling promise. Hannibal came home with anticipation, eager to rejoin his mate, but was instead greeted with the unwelcome and unwholesome scent of Francis Dolarhyde permeating the air. He knew just by Mr. Black's pinched, unhappy expression that the alpha servant had not behaved well, and inwardly wondered how on earth he could best separate his mate from Dolarhyde with minimal disruption to everyone's peace of mind. "His lordship is in the parlour," Mr. Black said, taking his coat, hat, and gloves.
"Has he made any headway in the cards?"
Hannibal asked, knowing well enough what an impossible task that was.
"When I last checked on him, he seemed quite flummoxed, my lord,"
Mr. Black said, tending to Hannibal's items with the greatest of dignity.
"I have taken the liberty of preparing tea." "Just the thing, I should think,"
Hannibal said, and moved through the quiet house to the parlour where Will was picking through the cards, looking unimpressed and, to Hannibal's eye, somewhat bored.
"May I join you?"
he asked, his scent reaching Will long before his voice. The way Will looked up at him, pleasure and relief blooming in his blue eyes, made Hannibal's heart lurch. It was a pleasant sensation, he found, more of a soar than a fall, though it felt equally as exhilarating. "Please do," Will said, clearing a place next him on the settee, a smile of welcome on his full mouth. "I recognize few of these names, and most that I do recognize are only from the society column. I have no basis from which to make decisions regarding them."
"Oh, for the most part, I just let Mr. Black handle them. Most are merely from courtesy and curiosity. Were there any invitations that tempted you?"
Will shook his head, somewhat abashed. "I find that this last hour here in the parlour has been the most relaxing of the day." Hannibal smiled, and reached out to stroke his cheek, noting the tired cast to Will's eyes and how pale he seemed. He was warm to touch again, warmer than he should be, and weary from plunging headfirst into a lifestyle he was not used to.
"Well, perhaps we should stay in,"
Hannibal said, his voice soft and coaxing. He slipped his hand up into Will's hair, smoothing his curls. Will's lids drooped a little in response to the soothing, and Hannibal's breathing evened out, matching the slow, steady rise and fall of Will's chest. He could see the soft throb of Will's heartbeat in his throat, and knew it beat in time with his own. Should Will give him the opportunity to bond with him, Alpha to Omega, it would be a bond to end all bonds, he knew. The powerful pull between them had the flavor of fate, but he refused to be star-crossed lovers. He would give this wonderful, brave, brilliant man the happily ever after he deserved, even if Hannibal himself might not be permitted to be a part of it.
"The pleasures of the capital can wait,"
Hannibal murmured, dropping his hand to Will so that he could lift it and kiss his knuckles.
"You are still recovering after all, and there is always tomorrow."
Will released a soft exhale of relief, wondering. "After so much enjoyment in the capital, I find myself longing for the peaceful quiet of Marsham Heath, or the familiar aged safety of Hertford. There's so much noise here, and so many people."
"People,"
Hannibal said, kissing Will's hand again and returning to the cards,
"are an acquired taste, and you have yet to acquire it. Give it time, Will. It will come. The right people will never drain you."
"You don't drain me," Will said, shifting to sit up straighter when Mr. Black admitted himself with a tea tray in hand. Hannibal smiled at that, gesturing for Mr. Black to leave the tray so he could pour for them both.
"I count myself as one of the lucky ones in that case."
"I suppose you must have noticed," Will said, taking his cup when Hannibal offered it. He sipped the tea with relish, feeling it warm him all the way to his bones. "Francis has returned?"
"He does have a certain air about him,"
Hannibal said, his nose wrinkling in response.
"Did he cause a fuss? Black looked as thunderous as a storm cloud on my entry."
"He was rather rowdy, almost beside himself with worry. He was frightened I was not where he had left me."
"He does understand we must all live our lives regardless of his approval?"
Hannibal asked, displeasure in every syllable.
"It is no fault of yours he left without explanation." "Did he give an explanation?"
"I did not press for one," Will said, troubled when he thought of the twisted bond that Francis had all but admitted to. Knowing now what he did, he had no choice but to keep the Alpha at a distance until further separation could be ordered. "He was far too agitated. I am considering how best I may return him to my sister's care. It would be much easier were we to have any indication of who is responsible for attempting to murder me. Perhaps then he would not feel so deeply compelled to protect me."
"I have every hope and expectation that with the detectives on the case, whoever they are will be brought to justice with all speed,"
Hannibal said, hoping to lighten Will's mood some.
"It relieves me to hear you speak of separating yourself from Dolarhyde. There is something about him which I cannot like."
Will sipped his tea again, wondering if Hannibal could somehow sense the twisted nature of Francis's connection to him, or if his own bond to Hannibal somehow prevented it altogether. There seemed to be some sort of sensitivity there, or perhaps it was simply that both of them were alphas in the end. Will opted to change the subject to one less dangerous, and asked, "How did you find Mr. Buddish?"
"It wasn't that well hidden, as it turns out,"
Hannibal said, grinning when Will cut a repressive, amused look at him.
"Berger had beaten me there, but I did drop off our letters to be posted. There were several responses to my advertisement for the estate manager position."
Will's amusement turned strained and unhappy, belying his light tone when he asked, "Are you still so determined to replace me?"
No, I am not determined to replace you, Will. Quite the opposite, in fact. I am trying to free you from your obligations in order to saddle you with others.
And what obligations are those?
Being Lord Clarges, of course.
Will's tension melted, and he ruefully admitted, "It seems to be more time-consuming than I first assumed it would be. Perhaps as Lord Clarges I will be very busy, in truth. We shall certainly have enough to occupy the both of us at Marsham Heath."
Mr. Buddish mentioned you had a letter from Mr. Wells. Any headway on your project?
"Yes, the crew is assembled to begin digging," Will told him, perking up at the mention of the renovations. "And we can hook up to Mosley's gas source, but I was thinking that we'll need to have a larger reserve tank so we can replace the coal boilers with gas ones, and What are you smiling at?" Hannibal, caught in the very act, said,
You?
"What on earth for?"
Because you are brilliant and beautiful and clever about the things I haven't the aptitude for,"
Hannibal told him, and leaned over to kiss the tip of his nose.
"And because I am lucky to know you."
"Nonsense!" Will declared it, and proceeded to explain his plans to Hannibal, but his cheeks stayed rosy with pleasure, and a smile curved his full mouth. The discussion required delving into the packet Mr. Wells had sent, and they went to Will's room to get comfortable. Dinner was served there informally off of a cart, when they finalized their plans and moved on to question of the new estate manager. Somewhere between the wine, the delicious food, and discussing their plans, Will realized something. He was happy. It came to him suddenly, quietly, without fanfare. He realized what it was when he was shuffling through the applications, and Hannibal leaned across him to pour them both more wine. There was something in the scent of his husband's skin, in the way Hannibal was so far into his space without overpowering him, in the easy way he smiled as he poured, and how the cords of his neck stood out in his throat, his neckerchief and jacket discarded hours before. Or something in the graceful bend of his surprisingly slender wrists, the elegant way in which he moved, even when not on the dance floor. Somewhere, in the sum of all those things, doing something so routine as managing the household affairs together, happiness wove itself into the web of Will's world, and it had the shape and scent of Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal glanced at him and saw his soft smile. He returned it with one of his own, saying nothing. He didn't have to. Will could feel Hannibal's contentment through his bond, and it filled him, equal to his own, but not influencing it as he had once feared his husband might be able to do. They were in the capital, and there were any number of things Hannibal could be doing, from gaming at his club to attending the theatre. Yet here he was at Will's side, relaxed and comfortable and radiating nothing but happiness, as if there was no place else he would rather be than in this room right here and right now. Will found he couldn't concentrate on the papers any more, and tidied them with care, just basking in the closeness that he felt. "We can take these back with us to Marsham," he said, sliding the sheaf of inquiries back into the envelope. "I'm eager to get back and start on the renovations."
"We can leave tomorrow, as you please,"
Hannibal told him, just watching him move, graceful in every gesture. His mate's driving need to be productive, to be engaged in positive activity for the betterment of those they were responsible for, was just another facet of his personality that delighted and impressed Hannibal. He could easily imagine the days stretching into months and years of being with Will just like this, in conversation and planning, in shared wine and shared ideas and shared smiles. Hannibal hoped with all of his heart that when Will did decide, he would do so in his favor, and let that potential become a reality. "I think I would feel more at ease were we to do so," Will admitted, sitting back with his wine and taking a sip. "I hate to leave here so suddenly. My time in Chelsea House has been so pleasant, like something from a dream."
"Well?"
Hannibal said, leaning forward to take Will's hand in his and kiss his fingertips, then his knuckles, a small smile playing on his lips.
"It is a dream which will always be here waiting for you, Will. The pleasures of the city are many and varied. It is best to explore them slowly, lest they lose their charm."
"Is that what you're doing with me?" Will asked, one dark brow shooting up. "Exploring me slowly, lest I lose my charm?" Hannibal grinned and turned Will's hand to press a kiss to his wrist, where the pulse throbbed beneath the surface of the skin, and his faint sense strengthened somewhat.
"On the contrary,"
he murmured, lips brushing against Will's wrist so that he shivered, a small and stifled movement that went deeper than he could properly rein in.
"I am savoring every unfolding flavor of my complex and surprising mate, as he allows me to." The journey is every bit as enjoyable as the destination, in your case."
Part of him hoped Will would take heed of his suggestion and invite him to stay, to share a few more hours before they were both too exhausted to do anything more than sleep. It was disappointing when Will gently disengaged his hand, but Hannibal's heart thundered with joy to see the blush on his cheeks and the smile on his lips. His desire to get closer to his mate was not one-sided, and he looked forward to a time when he might be able to hold Will through the night, kiss the slender column of his throat, treasure him with every breath in him for as long as life granted him time. "It must be late," Will said, brushing his hair back behind his ear, warmed by his husband's gentle coaxing. Hannibal fished his pocket watch out and noted the time. It was not the hour he spoke which surprised Will, but the sight of his blue garter threaded through the chain of Hannibal's watch and tied securely, a bright incongruent blue in the golden firelight. "Hannibal!" Hannibal glanced up and saw his reaction and grinned.
"What? My courtier gave me a favor. I should carry it with me always, don't you think?"
"Not in public! You cannot be brandishing my garter each time you check your watch."
"Nonsense, it was a gift. I can brandish it whenever I like. Besides, what if I were to suddenly catch sight of your knees? What chance would I stand in that case without it? This way, I have a part of you with me wherever I go."
Will's protest fell to fond smile. He wished he could decide then and there, just let everything fall away to the past and be at Hannibal's side in person rather than vicariously. But he couldn't, not yet. Deep in his secret heart lay doubts he dared not stir, resentments that would, perhaps, never die. He refused to be impulsive in this, with so much at stake, and so much to lose. "Honestly, you're incorrigible, Hannibal."
"Absolutely."
He got to his feet and bent over Will, stooping to kiss his forehead. Will longed for another kiss like those they had shared before, but hesitated to initiate it now, without the excitement of the ball to embolden him. He closed his eyes and enjoyed the soft kiss on his forehead, on the tip of his nose, and then on his hand, only opening his eyes when his husband said,
"Sleep tight, Will. Get all the rest you need."
"Good night, Hannibal," Will said, reluctant to let him go, but knowing it was for the best. Still, how empty the room felt once Hannibal left, casting a smile Will's way. Will hugged himself in a vain attempt at comfort, but only for a moment before he forced his hands to drop, breathing, "You are not so weak, Will Graham." But he questioned if it was truly weakness, or his bond, or simply what happened when someone turned out to be unexpectedly interesting, and gallant, and amusing, and thoughtful, and so very eager for his company. Feeling cold and uncertain, he undressed with his thoughts a million miles away, a half-heard chuckle escaping him when he recalled the moment that Hannibal had stared at his knee as if it had challenged him to a duel.
"If I were to be daily driven from rational thought by the sight of your garters, Will, then I would count myself a lucky man."
He tucked his nightshirt on with a sigh, bare toes curled in protest against the cold floor. He left his clothes neatly laid within the wardrobe for Jimmy to collect come morning, and went to his vanity to place his own watch in its box, idly musing that he should ask Hannibal for something of his and return the favor. When he reached his vanity, however, he found a rather large box marked Gideon and Garnet's waiting, pushed back out of notice, and remembered that Jimmy had mentioned he'd been sent a package. Never one to deny his curiosity for long, Will opened the box and gasped in surprise at the contents. It was entirely filled with an assortment of watches. Silver watches, gold-inlaid watches, crystal-faced watches, and those with open faces, some bejeweled, others deceptively plain until the etching was noted. There was a watch to please even the pickiest shopper. And for some reason they were all sitting in a box on Will's vanity. "Hannibal?" he called, hearing him in the washroom, the splash of water in the sink marking his usual evening routine of washing his face and cleaning his teeth and tending his nails. He was remarkably fussy about his nails, Will had discovered. He crossed to the washroom and knocked, saying again, "Hannibal!"
"Yes?"
Hannibal called. When Will opened the door, he was confronted with the sight of his husband in a distracting state of undress, scrubbing his face over the basin. When he straightened, reaching for a towel, Will saw why. He had pulled his stitches, the red seam of his wound angry from the abuse.
"I waited a bit longer than I should have," Hannibal said,
rubbing his face with the towel and drying his hands, questions in his amber eyes. His shirt was off, pants loosened at his waist. Will stared at the exposed chest and the thick hair there. A droplet of water coursed down the length of his throat and was caught, a glittering diamond in a forest of silver.
"Do you need the accommodation?"
"No," Will said, and turned to gesture vaguely at his vanity, annoyed when his eyes refused to follow the direction his head attempted to turn. Aggravated only with himself, he asked, "Why are those watches in my room? Have we robbed Mr. Gideon?"
"No."
Hannibal laughed, blotting the stinging little needle marks where the stitches had gone in. He tossed the towel aside, shoulders back a touch, his spine straightening just a bit, the alpha in him unable to resist highlighting the fact that he was in his prime and very much available. It was a fact that was certainly not lost on Will.
"Mr. Gideon suggested you might like one. Or two. Or all of them."
I don't need all of them, thank you," Will said firmly, getting a grip on himself and dragging his eyes up to meet Hannibal's, bristling when he saw the amusement there.
"Don't be thoughtful,"
Hannibal chided, finding it hard not to stare in return, beautiful as he was in his loose nightshirt, with his hair falling in tousled curls around his ears.
"A gentleman can never have too many watches."
"I have a watch," Will said, noticing his belly, which was perfectly trim with just a hint of softness. He swallowed hard. "It's a very nice watch." Hannibal reached for the nightshirt he'd hung behind the door and pulled it on. When he took a step toward him, Will refused to take a step back. "It's a remarkable watch," Will went on, resenting the way the shirt covered his husband's fine physique from view. "It's my favorite watch."
"Are you hoping that you will dissuade me by extolling the many splendors of your watch?"
Hannibal murmured, reaching out slowly to touch Will's cheek. "Don't be ridiculous. I have no need to dissuade you from anything," Will said, and he almost believed it. Almost.
"You need a few watches, Will, for different occasions. For work, for court." "Court! "For social outings,"
Hannibal said, chuckling at the horrified look on Will's face. Relenting, he said,
"Keep whichever among them appeals to you, Will. I only wanted to give you a gift."
"Why?" The question held so much disbelief it broke Hannibal's heart. Of course his mate would ask why he was being given a gift, gifts being so rare to him. They were only ever the result of another year of empty waiting, another holiday spent in a silent house refusing any company.
"That is a question which has many answers, Will,"
Hannibal said, cupping his cheek to smooth his thumb beneath Will's eye.
"Because you need them, because I want to give you things you might like or enjoy. But really it all boils down to me being selfish."
"Selfish? How is giving me gifts being selfish?"
"Because it gives me great pleasure to see you enjoying something I made possible."
Hannibal purred, tipping his head to nuzzle Will, inhaling the faint scent of his skin on a content breath.
"There is so much I would like to make possible for you, Will."
His mouth drew a teasing trail down Will's temple to the corner of his mouth, and he placed a soft kiss on Will's parted lips. Will blinked hard, trying to wake himself to some form of rational thought, surprised to find that he was as rational now as he'd ever been in his life. And he didn't want to sleep alone. "Hannibal?" he said, breathing his name on another kiss, both hands lifting to cup his jaw. "Hannibal."
"I've been wanting to do this all day,"
Hannibal whispered, his hand falling from Will's cheek to settle at his waist, his other arm curving behind Will's back to pull him close. The heat of him chased away the chill of the cold tiles, the chill of the loneliness that had settled on Will in the silence of his room. There was no place for such in the slow tease of his tongue, or the way he drew on Will's lip, sucking the plump fullness to nip him with sharp teeth. Will tangled one hand in Hannibal's hair, the fine silky sensation of it on his skin adding its own layer of pleasure. His body curved against Hannibal's on its own, seeking the heat and the pressure of him, not content to have any space between them. "Hannibal," he said, his thoughts getting lost when he slipped his tongue past his husband's lips to feel those sharp teeth on its tip. His vivid imagination easily considered 1,000 ways he could feel those teeth on him, and he moaned, drawing back to pant harshly, his forehead pressed to Hannibal's, both of them quivering with desire. His blue eyes met Hannibal's own amber gaze, smoky with hunger, but tempered with the understanding that his flesh was willing, but his heart begged for caution. "I cannot give you more than this, Hannibal," Will said, the words almost lost on a shaky exhale, nerves defeating his attempt to explain his fears. Hannibal kissed him again, soft and sweet. "I would never ask for more," he whispered, his grip on Will softening, hand stroking his taut back and the slender sweep of his side. "When you've already given me everything I need." Will's lips parted, but he could not speak to what was moving inside of him, because he could feel the truth of it through his bond to Hannibal. His husband meant it, believed it, was earnest in his sincerity. "The rest," Hannibal said, chest filled to bursting with tenderness for the young Omega in his arms, "will always be yours to choose." Will held his gaze for a long moment before he pulled away, solemn and fragile. He trailed a slow kiss over the healing slash on Hannibal's high cheek, a gentle apology in every soft press of his lips. Holding his husband's gaze, he stepped back only enough to grasp both of Hannibal's hands in his own before he moved back into the room, tugging Hannibal with him with a small, shy smile.